Hello and welcome to Lecture 3 of the Middle Ages. Last time in Lecture 2, I talked about sacred music of the Middle Ages, music that has to do with worship and religion. Today I'm going to talk about secular music, music that has nothing to do with religion or worship. But I want to recap just a little bit because last time I talked about first Gregorian chant, the original music of the church. And I talked about how over time there appeared this evolution of chant where it went from being strictly monophonic, a single line of music, to becoming polyphonic. Now at first it's a very simple type of polyphonic texture. We simply have the original Gregorian chant and a duplication, a sort of a harmonization of that melody at some regular interval, usually a fifth, maybe a fifth and an octave. Right? And this is the most primitive type of polyphonic music. It is known as parallel organum. However, we go through a period of evolution of hundreds of years from the early days of parallel organum, somewhere around the 8th century, perhaps, the 700s, the 800s. Over a period of hundreds of years, there develops a more complex style known as florid organum. And florid organum reaches its peak with the Notre Dame composers, who were music masters at Notre Dame Cathedral, certainly priests themselves, Leonin and Perotin, composing this what we call Notre Dame organum. This is more complex. The original notes of the chant are stretched out, and the additional lines are faster moving and rhythmically active. This is Notre Dame organum, and we're talking about the late 1100s, early 1200s. Well, right around that same time, we have some interesting developments in secular music. This is the time when pretty much the earliest singer, songwriter, poets that we know about begin composing songs. And these were members of the nobility, for the most part, and they were known as troubadours. Actually, there are several different types of knightly, with a K, members of the nobility, composer, songwriters, poets. The troubadours were the originals, and they are like late 1100s, early 1200s. But this idea kind of catches on, and it spreads from southern France to northern France, where we call these people trouvères. I'll explain why. There's a difference between troubadours and trouvères. And then even over into Germany, where they are known as minnesingers, and elsewhere throughout Europe as well. So each region of Europe has its own kind of category of singer, songwriter, poets, mostly the nobility, because again, you're not likely to know how to write unless you are certainly of the clergy, but then you're probably going to be writing mostly sacred works, or the nobility, because the commoners, for the most part, don't know how to read or write. And again, this is taking place against the backdrop of the later Middle Ages, when the nobility take more of an interest in becoming educated, becoming cultured, right? Learning how to write, appreciating good books and poetry and music and all that, what we might call increasing secularization. The farther we go into the Middle Ages, this kind of grip of the sacred on people's hearts and minds. Remember, I talked about how overall in the Middle Ages, the sacred realm was considered far more important than the secular, right? Because of this whole mindset that the afterlife is really the only thing that matters, etc. Well, this attitude, the later we get in the Middle Ages, it begins to change. And in fact, this is one of these things that paves the way for the Renaissance, right? But don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. So, in the late 1100s, the early 1200s, southern France is a distinct region which was at that time referred to as the Languedoc. Langue means language, and d'oc, D''OC, means the language of Oc. What is Oc? It was the word that people in that area used for yes. The word for yes was ok. So this language, this region where people used the word ok for yes, was known as the Languedoc. And it's basically the southern third, roughly, of France. The rest of France, by the way, more northerly France, was referred to as the Langue d'Oil, because the word that they used for yes was oil, which is similar to oui, the modern French word for yes. So we have different dialects. These are both Romance languages, so they're kind of similar to each other. In fact, when you listen to the example of the troubadour song, which is in your listening, you might hear that it sounds kind of like somewhere between Spanish and French, both of which are Romance languages, of course. I should explain perhaps what a Romance language is. The Romance languages are those languages which are sort of more or less descended from Latin, the language spoken in Rome. Therefore, the Romance languages, such as French, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, and a few others, are Romance languages. But in those days, there were many, many more distinct dialects, and one of them was this Occitan language. I guess it's kind of similar to Provençal, which is still, I guess there are still some speakers of Provençal in Provence in France. This region also is known as Aquitania. It was called Aquitania because that was the name of the old Roman province. Aquitaine, Aquitania as the Romans called it, but Aquitaine was its own separate duchy. It was ruled by a duke who was nominally under the King of France, but this was in a time when France wasn't really a centralized, the King of France, technically a duke of Aquitaine would be under the King of France, but there were times in French history when the King of France wasn't that particularly strong and powerful, and there were regional dukes that rivaled him in power. And one of these dukes was actually the earliest troubadour, and the book mentions him. It says here, troubadours and trouvères came from diverse social backgrounds. Some were nobles, such as William IX, Duke of Aquitaine, the first known troubadour. So I was researching a little bit about William IX, the first known troubadour. We don't think he was necessarily the very first, but he's the first whose works have survived. Right? There may have been other troubadours before him, but his works are the earliest that have survived. And there's a wonderful little anecdote that I found in my research for this lecture. And this is really illustrative of, remember how I said in the first lecture on the background how the nobility often clashed with the clergy, especially as we get later in the Middle Ages. The nobility are kind of playing this game of king of the hill with the clergy and kind of trying to flex a little bit on the clergy. And there had been tensions between the nobility and the clergy all through the Middle Ages. And I made the point that ultimately the clergy were more powerful for most of this time because they held that trump card of entry into heaven, or at least being saved from hell or purgatory. You had to stay in the good graces of the church if you wanted to get into heaven. You had to do what the clergy told you to do. And I mentioned how, for example, the clergy had this possibility of excommunication. Well, William, it turns out, was excommunicated twice. I'm not sure if he's in hell right now, but he was excommunicated twice. And on one of the occasions when he was excommunicated, let me see if I can find it here. And I'm just reading from Wikipedia. It says, William, like his father and many magnates at the time, had a rocky relationship with the church. He was excommunicated twice. The first time in the year 1114, well, that can't be, 1114, for an alleged infringement of the church's tax privileges. So some kind of conflict over taxes. The church had the power to tax, to tithe, and apparently maybe William was trying to muscle in on that. So he was excommunicated, and his response was to demand absolution, that is, relief from excommunication, from Peter, the Bishop of Poitiers. Now, the bishop didn't take kindly to this, and he was pronouncing the anathema, that is, the final excommunication, against William, in William's presence. As the bishop was at the point of pronouncing the anathema, the Duke, William, threatened him with a sword, swearing to kill him if he did not pronounce absolution. It's like, no, 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 you don't excommunicate me. You absolve me or I'm going to kill you. Bishop Peter, surprised, pretended to comply, but when the Duke, satisfied, released him, the bishop completed reading the anathema before calmly presenting his neck and inviting the Duke to strike. And he says, there, I've excommunicated you. Now, if you want to kill me, go ahead. According to contemporaries, William hesitated a moment before sheathing his sword, putting it away, and replying, I don't love you enough to send you to paradise. So you can see, William took this seriously. He wasn't apparently so concerned about himself going to hell, but he didn't want to kill the bishop at that moment and send him to heaven. He said, I don't love you enough to send you to paradise. So just a kind of an amusing anecdote about William. Tells you maybe what kind of a guy he was, pretty hot-headed. Anyway, most troubadours were not as high-ranking as William, but they were mostly members of the nobility. Now, some of the, as I said, just because you are a member of the nobility doesn't necessarily mean that you are wealthy. There is such a thing as impoverished nobility. We can't think of the nobility as automatically being rich just because they're nobles. There were families who had runs of bad luck. Gambling was a big problem in the Middle Ages. Maybe a bad harvest or bad investments of one kind or another. It was possible even for members of the nobility to fall on hard times. Now, if you are a member of the nobility and you don't, if you're from the impoverished nobility, maybe one way that you can maybe get yourself back into a better lifestyle was to become a courtier, to seek out higher ranking members of the nobility, maybe someone like William, the Duke of Aquitaine, and introduce yourself, kind of hang around at his court, and make yourself useful, make yourself entertaining, make yourself pleasant to be around. Make yourself the kind of person that a wealthy, powerful noble would want to have around. And that might be one way of getting back into a better position in life. So before I go on too much about the troubadours, I will come back to them, but I want to mention about how the troubadours inspired the trouvères, similar kind of noble composer, poets living in northern France, and then the Minnesingers in Germany. Again, the same kind of thing, except they are in Germany. They're writing their songs in German. The term Minnesinger, by the way, I think it's sometimes written Minnesang. Minnesang simply means love song in this sort of old form of German. Minne means love and sang means song. So they are referred to as the Minnesangers, or if we kind of put it into something closer to English, the Minnesingers, the singers of love songs. So all of these guys, the troubadours, who are the originals, the trouvères, the Minnesingers, and also their equivalents in other countries in Europe. It's just that those three are usually considered kind of the most important, but they had their equivalents in Italy, in Spain, etc. The kinds of songs they were writing were all love songs, but there are certain stylized kind of love song coming out of this culture, this subculture known as courtly love. Love at court. Love in the court of a powerful noble like a king or a duke. the kind of love that we're talking about here is not like boy meets girl, they fall in love, they get married, they live happily ever after. No. Remember, this is a time when love and marriage have really not much to do with each other. People didn't marry for love, certainly not the nobility, and probably not the lower classes either. Within the nobility, you married to establish certain family connections, right? Especially if there was you wanted to marry up if possible, like if you knew of a nobleman who had an available daughter and they were wealthier than you would try and get your son maybe married off to their daughter or vice versa, right? It was a way of sort of climbing that ladder, and also maybe consolidating land, just forging alliances. So that's what marriage was all about. And no doubt, some of these people in these sort of arranged marriages, maybe, they were paired off when they were children and maybe actually married when they were 14, 15 years old. Some of them probably did fall in love with each other after they were married, but you can imagine there were a lot of miserable, unhappy, loveless marriages at this time. So courtly love it is just understood that it is love outside of marriage. It is adulterous love. Now, it may or may not be like consummated. It might be sort of like in fact, it very often takes the form in these songs, the way it's described, as yearning for someone who is unattainable, and maybe even someone who is cruel to you, but nonetheless you're in love with them anyway. Usually it's the person singing the song, the poet who has written the song, is singing about their love for someone who is unattainable, maybe because they are the wife of that higher ranking nobleman, right? This was such a common pattern. You kind of have to wonder, is it really sincere, or was it that was just like the understood style of the time? The same way in our love songs today, there's a lot of the same kinds of like categories of love songs. And you wonder about, well, did the person who wrote that song really go through that? Or is that just kind of like what they expect their audience is going to like? What's going to make it a hit or whatever? Same kind of thing with the troubadours. In fact, I kind of suspect that, like if you are a troubadour and you're in the court of some king or some duke and you are writing songs about how you are madly in love with the duke's wife, but she pays you no attention. She ignores you. Sometimes she's kind to you. Sometimes she's cruel to you, but you can't help yourself. You're madly in love with her. If you were to perform this song at court in the presence of the duke, you might think, well, wait, the duke he's going to cut my head off. I'm singing here about how I'm madly in love with his wife. Well, maybe not necessarily. Maybe it's all understood to be kind of a game, first of all. That it's not sincere, it's a game, and it's flattering to him because, hey, look, this guy's in love with my wife. And he's singing about how my wife, he can't attain her. She's of too high of a station. She's sometimes kind to him, sometimes cruel to him, but ultimately he's getting nowhere with her. So all this could be actually quite satisfying and entertaining to the duke or the king or whoever's court you are in. Okay, let me talk a little bit about some of these troubadours. One thing that they did, which is kind of interesting, is they would write their own little biographies, which were called vidas. Vita means life, sort of like when you write a vita when you're applying for a job. Same kind of thing, except there's a D in there, V-I-D-A. So the vita is the brief biography written by the troubadour, by the poet himself, as sort of like his calling card, right? And some of these are quite entertaining to read. So here is one. Here's a vita of a troubadour named Guillaume, basically William, Guillaume Adhemar. So this is him writing about himself. Guillaume Adhemar was from Givaudan, from a castle called Mirius. He was a nobleman, the son of a poor knight, and the lord of Mirius made him a knight. He was a very worthy and eloquent man, and knew well how to compose poetry. he was unable to support his rank as a knight, so he became a juggler. And he was greatly honored by the whole of high society. Okay, what is a juggler? I thought we were talking about troubadours here, not jugglers. Well, in addition to the troubadours, and there isn't necessarily a sharp distinction between them, there are some sort of like musician, poet, composers we refer to as troubadours, and others we call jogglers or jongleurs or minstrels, right? And the basic distinction, although again it's not a hard and fast rule, but the troubadours composed songs, composed poetry, set these poems to music, and sometimes performed them, but didn't necessarily perform them themselves. They were more like the composers. Whereas it's kind of understood that the jogglers or jongleurs or minstrels performed songs that were often written by others, maybe written by the troubadours. So the way this might work is, let's say you are a poor knight, right? You are unable to sustain yourself as a knight, but because you are of the nobility of the late Middle Ages, you are educated enough that you know how to write poetry, and maybe even you can play an instrument of some kind. And you might wander the countryside from castle to castle, entertaining the nobility, hoping to ingratiate yourself with the wealthy, powerful duke or king or whatever. So you might, knock on the door of a castle one day and say, "Good evening, sir. My name is William," or whatever. "Here is my vita. May I come and entertain you at table tonight?" And then the Duke might say, "Well, sure. I've written some songs too. If you would like to perform them." So this is how this relationship might work. But some of these jongleurs or minstrels or jogglers probably wrote their own songs, and some of these troubadours no doubt performed their own songs. It's hard to know exactly, but that's kind of the difference. By the way, the word jongleur or joggler, it means a juggler, apparently. And this is because these kind of itinerant entertainers that would travel from one castle to another, hoping to find maybe a permanent position, they didn't just sing songs. They had this whole routine. They had a sort of a bag of tricks. They would sing songs. They would perform acrobatics. They might have like a trained dog that could jump through a hoop, and they could maybe juggle a bit. So they were sort of all-purpose entertainers. And this is at a time when, as again, I think I might have mentioned in the lecture on social background of the Middle Ages, living as a nobleman in a castle is not all that it might seem to be cracked up to be from our perspective. Castles were very often like out in the countryside, isolated. They were cold and musty and damp, and there's not a lot of entertainment. There's not a lot to do. So when some guy knocks on your door and says, "Hey, I can sing songs, I can do acrobatics, I can juggle, I got this trained dog," and you're like, "Wow, come on in, this is great." Right? You see something actually similar to this if you're familiar with Hamlet by Shakespeare. So Hamlet is a late medieval prince, and there is a troupe of performers, the players, who are passing by. And Hamlet invites them in and says, "Yeah, I want to put on a play." Of course, it's the play in which he exposes the evil of his uncle. But that's the kind of thing that we're talking about, these wandering entertainers. Eventually, again, the dream, the goal of one of these entertainers would be to get sort of a permanent position within the court of a powerful nobleman. And we'll see as we get into the Renaissance and especially the Baroque era, these kings and dukes would employ they would employ musicians, painters, craftsmen of every kind, dance masters who would put on ballet productions or even later opera productions, right? So there was a real demand for entertainment from the nobility. Okay. Anyway, I was talking about the life story. Here's another funny of Vita, and this is more of a funny, humorous kind. These guys were probably comedians as well, like court jesters. This one is deliberately kind of self-mocking. So this is the Vita of a jongleur or a troubadour named Arnaud de Mauriel. So he's writing this about himself. Arnaud de Mauriel was from the bishopric of Perigord, from a castle called Mauriel, and he was a humble cleric. So if he was a cleric, that means he was of the clergy, which means he knows how to read and write. He's educated. Because he was unable to live by his learning, he traveled around the world. He was a fine composer of poetry. Fortune took him to the court of the Countess of Bourlatz, and the Countess favored him and honored him, and he fell in love with her and composed songs about her. But he did not dare tell anyone that he had composed them himself. He said that someone else had composed them. But love made him compose a song in which he revealed his love for the Countess. The Countess did not shun him, but welcomed his words and was pleased with them. And she gave him fine clothing and honored him and encouraged him to write more poems about her. So he composed many good songs, which reveal that he received both very good and very bad treatment from her. All right. Actually, that wasn't the humorous one that I was looking for, but I think that's about... Oh, here's... This is the one that I was looking for. Again, one of these Vitas, life stories of the troubadours. And this guy's name is Gaucelm Faidit. And he's describing himself. Gaucelm was a troubadour from the Limousin region, where limousines come from, Limousin. And he sang worse than anyone in the world, but he composed many good melodies and good poems. He became a juggler because he lost everything he owned in a game of dice. He was a very big man and was very greedy, both in eating and drinking. That is why he became extremely fat. And he wandered around the world from place to place for 20 years because no one wanted either him or his songs. Later, he married an actress who was very clever and very beautiful, and she became as big and fat as he was. And the Marquis of Montferrat provided money and clothing for him and honored both him and his songs. So notice how they always mention their patron in there, right? Who is supporting them, who is honoring them with money, etc. Okay, the songs themselves of the troubadours, the book mentions this. It's kind of important to know that these songs, very often, all that is indicated are the words. So all we have are the words of the song because the composer maybe didn't write down the melody. Maybe he didn't feel that he needed to write down the melody because he could sort of remember the melody, but he might have written down the words because those are harder to remember. If you've ever sang in a band or whatever, the singer always, they're always going to write down the words. They might not necessarily write down the melody. Sometimes the melody and the pitches are written down, right? Just the melody and the pitches. But there is never any indication of the rhythm. Two reasons for this. First of all, since all of this poetry was in a certain meter. Remember I talked about poetic meters, how you have stressed syllables and unstressed syllables, and all poetry was in some kind of a meter. The rhythm of the tune probably simply matched the meter of the poetry. And so we can kind of imagine what the rhythm sounded like. And in fact, in the troubadour song, which you're going to hear in your listening, there is a rhythm there. They basically made an educated guess at what that rhythm would have sounded like. The notes they know, the rhythm they don't know, but you can make an educated guess. Another issue, the reason that they didn't write the rhythms is these people probably didn't know how to write rhythms. Rhythmic notation, the writing of rhythms, was kind of in its infancy at this time. Writing pitches had been around for quite a while. So remember I talked about how in the Gregorian chant, when they started to be written down, you'd have a line and then you just have some dots above and below the line to indicate how high or how low the pitches are. And then later on it was 4 lines. And then finally, much later, 5 lines, which is what we have in modern music notation. So there had been ways of notating pitches for a long time, but not really any way of notating rhythm. The way that rhythm was notated, this is what we see, again, going back to organum. Remember, one of the important things about organum, the organum of the late 11th, early 12th century, the Notre Dame organum, this is the earliest music where the meter is indicated, where we know exactly what the rhythm is. Now, it's sort of a primitive system of rhythmic notation that those guys had, Léonin and Perrotin, the Notre Dame composers. It was a system based on sort of prefabricated rhythmic modes, which were repeated over and over again. But it was a system. It was a beginning. That was cutting edge at the time. That was something that the leading composers, the most sophisticated professional composers like Léonin and Perrotin, knew about. These guys probably didn't know about this kind of technique for notating rhythm, so they didn't write down the rhythm. They just wrote down the pitches and the words, sometimes just the words. Also, there's no indication of instruments that might have been played. There was just the melody. There's nothing like, okay, here's the lute part, or here's where you play a fiddle. We don't know for sure, but we think that these songs were probably accompanied with instruments, maybe sometimes sung just solo, a cappella, if there were no instruments available. But we know that many of these performers knew how to play instruments. And again, we can make an educated guess as to what that accompaniment might have sounded like based on the kinds of instruments that they had at the time. So in the recording of the example of the troubadour song, you will hear some instruments in there. That example, by the way, is by a female troubadour. So we even have some female troubadours at this time. And these are the earliest female composers of secular music that we know about in Western music. This one in particular in your book, her name is Beatrice, and she was a countess. Beatrice, Countess of Dia, who is a female troubadour, a troubadourisse, from the town of Dia in southern France. And of course, her love songs are written instead of to women that she can't attain because she is a lowly knight or whatever. It's about this song in particular is about a man whom she's having problems with. So the lyrics here, she sings, "I must sing of what I'd rather not. I am so angry about him whose friend I am, for I love him more than anything. Mercy and courtliness don't help me with him, nor does my beauty or my rank," that is my station as a countess. "I'm beautiful, I'm a countess, and yet none of it is of any help. Mercy and courtliness don't help me with him, nor does my beauty or my rank, nor my mind, for I am every bit as betrayed and wronged as if I deserve if I were unattractive." Like, he treats me as if I were unattractive. Here I am, a countess, and he's treating me like this. So again, not the happily ever after kind of love song. It's almost always some kind of unrequited love. All right. Okay, so moving on, I think I mentioned about the minstrels or jongleurs, wandering entertainers, often of a sort of a lower level of nobility than the troubadours, trouvères, who are generally of a higher level. The book mentions them briefly, and then it talks about purely instrumental music of the Middle Ages. So just a little bit about this. About the earliest, that is the oldest examples of purely instrumental music that we have are these estampillés. An estampillé is a certain kind of dance that was popular, apparently, like in the 1200s or so. Now remember, this is a time when vocal music is just more important than instrumental music. For one thing, remember our context of sacred versus secular, the fact that sacred music is more important, generally speaking. There's much more of it that has survived. And the church frowns on, more than frowns on, officially forbids the playing of instruments in church because that's associated with paganism. Now, there were certainly many people who knew how to play instruments in the Middle Ages, but these people were probably mostly musically illiterate. They didn't know how to write down melodies. They just knew how to play an instrument, and they learned by ear, and these tunes were passed on by ear. But Beginning, let's say, around the late 1100s, the 1200s, we start to see some instrumental music that is written down. And this is mostly instrumental music meant to accompany dancing, right? So if you're, again, if you are a nobleman and you have a court and you're putting on some sort of a, entertainment and you have dancing, you have to have some music. And so some of it might need to be written down, especially if you've got a group of musicians who don't all know the same songs as each other because they're from, they've memorized different songs. And do you know this tune? Well, no, but do you know this tune? If we have some written down that we can all read and play, it makes things a little easier. So the earliest examples of purely instrumental music that we have happen to be these estampillés, and they're from the later Middle Ages, again, maybe 1200s or so. And the estampillé was a lively, stomping, thumping kind of dance. That's where it's a stamp, it's a stomp. That's literally what the word means, a stamping dance. And in these songs, or they're not really songs because songs are sung, in these dance pieces of instrumental music, basically all you have written down is the melody. And we know that it's an instrumental piece because there's a melody and no words, right? So we have a pretty good idea that, and based on this, that it's a piece not to be sung, but to be played on instruments. Doesn't specify what instruments, unfortunately. These estampillés didn't say, okay, this is to be played on a flute and this is to be played on a violin. They probably didn't really even care that much what instruments were played. You just played whatever you had. There was no such thing as like a standard orchestra with a dozen first violins and a dozen second violins and 6 violas and 6 cellos or whatever. There was just like, bring what you've got and we'll play this tune and people will dance. Right? In the example of the estampillé, which is in your listening, you will hear the melody being played on a rebec, which is a bowed-stringed instrument. Actually, it's the same bowed-stringed instrument that you heard in the background when that chant by Hildegard, right, which I played a bit of in the last lecture, which is again in your listening. So a rebec is sort of like a violin shaped instrument. It's played lower down on the arm. It's not held up here. It's played down here. It's played with a bow and with a pipe, a simple flute-like instrument. So the rebec and the pipe are playing the melody. And there is a drone that is added, a drone accompaniment. Remember, a drone is just like the same note repeated over and over again or held for a long time. It's the simplest kind of accompaniment. It's just a repeated note or a repeated chord over and over. When someone is droning on and on in a monotone, that's literally what that means. Drone and a monotone, basically the same kind of thing. And in this case, that drone is played on a psaltery. A psaltery is sort of like a harp-like instrument with a resonating box. And you can hear they just kind of strumming across the thing. It sounds kind of like a ukulele or something. All right, so listen to that estampillé, earliest example that we have in the West of purely instrumental music. All right, so I've got a little bit of time left in this lecture now to talk about the Ars Nova. And in the book, actually, we would be taking up right around page 77, because what the book does, after talking about the troubadours and the minstrels and the estampillés, they talk about organum. I already talked about organum in the previous lecture because that's sacred music. So now I'm going to talk about this period of time at the very end of the Middle Ages, this period just within music history, known as the Ars Nova, or the New Art. Okay. I guess we should start with, well, what is new about it? Why is it called the Ars Nova, or New Art? Well, it really gets its name from a treatise or a textbook, basically, on music, on music theory, kind of, that was created around this time. It's a book describing some new practices that composers are taking up. And as I recall, this pamphlet, which the title of which is Ars Nova, the new art of music, is kind of criticizing these practices, actually. And this is very often the case. Some new technique or some new style or some new practice comes along, and scholars or critics take a look at it and they don't like what they see, and they write and they criticize it as being the wrong way to go. Anyway, Ars Nova is the name of this book. And so that, since it describes these new techniques, that name was given to this period, which is basically the 1300s. And in particular, its developments in the 1300s in music within France. France is, in the late Middle Ages, really sort of like the leading cultural center, right? It's sort of like the cutting edge of culture. Notice, of course, the Gothic style in architecture comes out of France during this time, right? Polyphony, the earliest polyphonic music, comes out of France at this time. The songs of the troubadours, the first secular love songs, right, come out of France during this time. So France is kind of like where it's at culturally, right? So now this style does kind of spread into other regions, in particular to Italy. And I'm going to talk actually a little bit about the two most important composers of the time in France and in Italy. In Italy, during this same period, the 14th century, the 1300s, Italy is also seeing sort of a cultural revival, let's say, which we might expect because as we get into the next era, the Renaissance, it's Italy that kind of takes over as the cultural leader. The Renaissance really kind of begins in Italy and then spreads throughout the rest of Europe. But in Italy, this period, the 1300s, is known as the Trecento, which basically just kind of means 1300s. And this is a time of great cultural flowering, especially in literature. This is when Dante Alighieri is writing his famous Divine Comedy, the three-part sort of tour of the afterlife, beginning with the Inferno, and then Purgatorio and Paradiso, hell, purgatory, and paradise. You've heard of Dante's Inferno, that may be the most, certainly the greatest poem of the Middle Ages, maybe the greatest of all time. We also have other, we have the Decameron by Boccaccio, you may have heard of. The Decameron is basically 100 stories. It's about a group of nobles who are trying to flee the Black Plague, right? The plague is appearing in the cities in the late 1340s. And if you could get away, just sort of like COVID times, if you could get away from the cities and maybe go to an estate someplace out in the country and ride it out. So it's a story about a bunch of noblemen, young noblemen, who, in escaping the plague, they go out to the country house and they're bored, they don't have anything to do, so they swap stories. That's what the Decameron is. It's this sort of collection of stories under the conceit of a bunch of bored young people swapping stories, riding out the plague. Anyway, it's a great period of cultural activity, especially in literature in Italy. It is known as the Trecento. So the Trecento in Italy and the Ars Nova period in France are going on at the same time. The leading composer in France is a guy named Guillaume de Machaut, and he is not only the leading composer, he's regarded as the greatest musician of the time, he is also the leading French poet of the time. Over in Italy, the leading composer, the leading musician of the time, is a guy named Francesco Landini. Right? So Landini and Machaut are living at the same time, and they're basically the two greatest composers of their time. The book doesn't really deal too much with Landini, but I do want to mention him briefly as, number one, the greatest Italian musician of the 1300s, and also kind of a remarkable guy because he was blind from very early childhood. When he was in the single-digit years, when he was like a little baby, I think he contracted some kind of a high fever, which he barely survived. But when he survived, he had lost his sight. And what do you do with a child that's lost their sight in the Middle Ages? Well, you might train him in music. And so Landini became an expert musician on many different instruments, but especially on the keyboard. And this was they did have organs back then. I think the harpsichord is just being developed around this time, but Landini is known as the greatest keyboard player in Europe, basically, and also a great composer of songs. And what's interesting about Landini is, and also to a lesser extent about Machaut, I'll get to Machaut next, but Landini seems to have composed only secular music. Never composed any, as far as we know, he never composed any sacred music at all. And that's kind of a remarkable thing for a composer of the Middle Ages. And it's something that you would only see toward the end of the Middle Ages as part of this trend of increasing secularization. The idea that it would be worth, spending your time and your energy being a trained composer and writing nothing but secular songs, love songs or whatever, trivial nonsense. That's, at least that would have been the earlier medieval attitude. But by the late medieval, we see excellent, trained, quote unquote, professional composers writing secular music, not just sacred music, right? So if we were to generalize about the Middle Ages altogether, we would say most important musicians were priests, were members of the clergy, and most important music was sacred music because, again, that's the culture. The sacred is more important than the secular. But this is less true as we get to the later Middle Ages, and times are changing. And pretty soon they're going to change pretty dramatically as we get into the Renaissance. And so this is an indication of that gradual shift in mindset. Landini, greatest Italian composer of his day, wrote, as far as we know, only secular songs. How about Machaut? Well, Machaut was actually an ordained priest. He spent much of his career not as as a pastor in a church somewhere, but as an official in the church, like someone up there in the leadership of the church, and also as a secretary to various noblemen, high-ranking noblemen. Remember, the nobility often liked to keep clerics around, members of the clergy, because of how well educated they were, how well they wrote. They were very useful to the nobility. So that's how Machaut spent much of his career, as sort of a court secretary, and in various sort of administrative roles in the church. So Machaut was a priest, and he was well trained in music. And yet, most of the music he wrote were secular love songs, right? He did write, as far as we know, only one sacred work. At least there's only one sacred work by Machaut which has survived. And that is his Mass of Notre Dame, which we'll talk about a little bit. But just, again, I want to stress the point that here we have a Catholic priest and a musician, maybe the greatest composer of his day, and yet he spends most of his time composing love songs rather than composing sacred music. Kind of remarkable, and it's, again, sort of an indication of things to come as we go into the Renaissance. Okay, so we have an example of one of his love songs and of one movement from his Mass of Notre Dame. And I'm going to spend the rest of our time talking about these two, and then you can listen to them on your own. I'm not going to have time to play them here in the lecture, but you can certainly click on and listen to them. They are also, remember, all of these listening identification examples, all these, anything that I expect you to listen to, you can find them in the playlist on my YouTube channel, and they're also embedded, of course, in your text with the listening guides there. So, what is new? Before we start talking about Guillaume, what is it that is new about the music of this time that was written about in that book that I talked about, The New Art, the Ars Nova? The main thing that is new, now there are several things that are new, but the main thing that is new about music of the Ars Nova of the 1300s is that somehow there has been developed a new way of writing rhythm. So that composers are now not limited to the old system of the rhythmic modes, which we see from, let's say, 100, 150 years earlier, 200 years earlier, which composers like Leonin and Perotin were using, right? This simple system of combinations of short notes and long notes, and you put them together in different combinations and you come up with different rhythms. In this newer way of writing rhythms, you can specify any duration you want. It's sort of like modern rhythmic notation, where you can have any length. It's not just your standard short and your standard long, right? So we have a new system of rhythmic notation which allows composers to create very complex rhythms, not just the simple rhythms that we find in organum. We also have the possibility of dividing the beat into two instead of into three. Remember, I said that in organum, the rhythmic subdivision was always in threes, perhaps because of this symbolic importance of the trinity. Well, now, with this new system of rhythmic notation, we can divide notes into twos. We can divide them into threes if we want to still, right? So because we have this ability now to create complex rhythms, composers like Machaut kind of go a little bit crazy, and they create very difficult, complex rhythms just simply because they can. It's sort of like, imagine, you're a kid and you've been playing with Legos, but all you have, you got a big box of Legos, but there's only two different size pieces. There's a longer piece and there's a shorter piece, right? And yeah, if you use your imagination, you can come up with some interesting stuff. But then imagine you get the new super deluxe Legos where there's every kind of piece imaginable, the kind of structures that you might create. Something very similar goes on in the 1300s, and suddenly music becomes much more complex rhythmically. And you will hear that especially in the sacred piece, the Notre Dame Mass. We'll get to the Notre Dame Mass in a second, but first let's look at this love song by Guillaume. Now, what is a priest doing writing love songs? Well, I don't know, priests didn't always stick to their vows of chastity and whatnot. But what's funny about Guillaume in particular is that he seems to have fallen in love when he was in his 60s and 70s. He fell in love with a 16-year-old girl named Perron. Now, who knows if this was sort of like one of these troubadour love stories where he's in love with her, but he knows he has no chance with her. But we do have, there are letters actually back and forth between them, which were preserved. In fact, Machaut preserved these letters himself. And he sort of created this book with the letters between himself and Perron, and also these songs that he wrote to her. It's called The Book of the True Story, The Book of the True Tale. And one of the songs from this book is the piece that is in your listening, which is called Puisqu'on oublie. Remember, the title of pretty much any song, a song that has words, not like the Estampillé, which is instrumental, but the title of any song from the Middle Ages and on into the Renaissance generally is the first few words you hear. So the first words you hear in French are Puisqu'on oublie, since I am forgotten. Right? And you've got the entire text of the song there in your listening guide, page 79. And it's very much in the style of the troubadour songs. Now, the troubadour songs are like 150 years before this song, but that style, it shows how influential the style of the troubadours was, right? That even 150 years later, a very sophisticated, well-educated, trained composer like Machaut is writing songs that, at least in the text, are very much in the style of troubadour songs. Right? There's kind of like mopey, unrequited love songs. The difference is Machaut is much more sophisticated. This song, for one thing, is polyphonic in texture, unlike the troubadour songs, which were either monophonic, just with a single melody, or if they had instruments joining in, you could say they were homophonic, because now you'd have melody and instruments to accompany. Machaut is a trained composer not just sort of like a singer-songwriter who does it as a hobby. He is a trained composer, and he knows how to compose in polyphonic texture. And that's what this song is. You will hear several different voices going on at the same time. They're all singing the same words, but they're singing in polyphonic texture. And the words of this song are, "Since I am forgotten by you, sweet friend, I say farewell to joy and a life of love. Ill-fated was the day I placed my love in you, since I am forgotten by you, sweet friend. But what I have promised you I will maintain, which is that I shall never have any other lover." And then he repeats the first line, "Since I am forgotten by you, sweet friend, I say farewell to joy and a life of love." All right. Okay, so now a little bit about the Notre Dame Mass. So the significance of the Notre Dame Mass, it's a little bit hard to explain, but it is a landmark in music history. Here's how the book describes it. It says, "Machaut's Notre Dame Mass, one of the finest compositions known from the Middle Ages, is also of great historical importance. It is the first polyphonic treatment of the Mass Ordinary by a known composer." All right, so I'm going to take a little bit of time and explain what that means. But first, be aware that the Notre Dame Mass by Machaut has nothing to do with the earlier Notre Dame composers, Léonin and Perotin, 150 years earlier, who worked at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. What do the words Notre Dame mean? It simply means Our Lady, obviously the Virgin Mary, right? So Notre Dame of Paris is basically the Cathedral of Our Lady. That's all that means. And the composers who worked there back in the late 1100s, early 1200s, as it was being built, are known as the Notre Dame composers. But here, Machaut has composed a Mass, and he simply calls it the Mass to Our Lady. It is dedicated to the Virgin Mary, therefore it's called the Notre Dame Mass, or the Messe de Notre Dame in French. So I've already talked about the Mass like 2 lectures ago. The Mass is, of course, the ritual that goes on in a Catholic church on Sundays. And, of course, the prayers of the Mass were sung, were chanted. But what we're talking about here is the Mass's evolution from some prayers that are sung to the musical Mass, a genre of music, right? Which is a 5-movement work, sort of like a book with 5 chapters. There are 5 parts to a Mass, the musical genre I'm talking about now. And those 5 parts are simply those 5 ordinary prayers: the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, and the Agnus Dei. So what composers began to do is they said, well, Machaut appears to have been the first to do this, the first that we know about. Again, this is a long time ago. There might have been other composers who did something similar, but their work was lost. Machaut seems to have been the first person to look at those 5 ordinary prayers and see them as the potential basis for a unified 5-movement composition, where those particular musical settings are meant to be performed as a group. They have some like cohesion, some artistic cohesion. Prior to Machaut, of course, people had been composing Mass movements for hundreds of years. If you were a choir master, like Léonin and Perotin back 150 years ago in Notre Dame Cathedral, you had to, of course, perform a Mass every single day, but you would maybe, take some previously composed movements off the shelf and say, okay, I'm going to use this Kyrie that some guy composed, 50 years ago, and I'm going to write a new Gloria myself, and then we'll use this Credo over here. So these Masses, in terms of music, they would sort of mix and match, sometimes use things that they had just composed and trying them out for the first time, and maybe some reused, some that had been composed by a previous choir master, some other composer, right? They would very often compose them in pairs. So you might compose a Kyrie and a Gloria, or a Sanctus and a Credo, or whatever. But Machaut seems to have been the first to have conceived of the Mass as a unified composition, the Mass Ordinary, that is, the 5 prayers which remain the same every day of the church calendar, sort of the core of the Mass. So it is the first polyphonic, that is, in polyphonic texture, many voices going along at the same time, with their own melodic line of equal importance and independence. The first polyphonic treatment of the Mass Ordinary by a known composer. Now, what we are hearing in your listening is just the Agnus Dei, the last of the 5 movements of this Mass, right? So there's going to be a Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, and Agnus Dei. They've just kind of like excerpted the Agnus Dei and put it in as a listening example, right? And the Agnus Dei is, of course, based on Gregorian chant. And Machaut took that Gregorian chant, changed the rhythm around a little bit. Remember, he has this new system of rhythmic notation, which is a characteristic of the Ars Nova period. And so he alters that Gregorian chant and places it in the tenor, right? The lowest of these voices. They hadn't really started using the bass voice yet. The tenor usually has the Gregorian chant, and the upper 3 parts have newly composed melodies, which, as you will hear, are quite complex rhythmically. And as these voices intersect with each other, they create some kind of strange harmonies, at least to our ears, right? This harmonically, this does not sound probably like anything you've ever heard before if you haven't listened to it yet. There are going to be some strange dissonances in there. And this is a consequence of the fact that we have independent melodies going on at the same time. And sometimes they are creating consonance, sometimes they are creating dissonance. All right. They're all singing the same words, but not exactly at the same time. The syllables, you can hear, are sometimes out of sync with each other, and then they will line up at the end of a phrase. And then they start the next phrase, and these voices, again, sort of are moving independently from each other, sometimes creating what we might consider strange dissonant sounds, harmonies. All right. So listen to the Agnus Dei by Machaut, and also listen to his secular love song, Puisqu'on oublie. And this is basically going to be the conclusion of our lectures on the Middle Ages, which, when you think about it, I've just covered 1,000 years of music in 3 lectures. Not ideal, but we don't have a lot of time. We've got to move on to the Renaissance. So our next lecture is going to be all about basically the historical background of the Renaissance and maybe a little bit on the musical characteristics of the Renaissance. See you then.